This is the Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. This is episode 43. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster, as always, and we're here with very special guest, Dr. Christopher Bader. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. Now, I explained in the intro right before this to the listeners that you were my mentor coming up through becoming certified as a certified mental performance consultant through ASP, and you've been a big influence on my development as a professional, but also a development as a human being and how to think about not only our own minds, but the minds of our clients and the minds of the people that we work with. So that's why I wanted to have you on the show. And I always start my show off the same way with the same question. It's my only standardized question. And I kind of just want to get a sense of what the title of the podcast means to you. Now, the title is Conversations with the Mind. And being a psychologist, doing the work with the mind, what is your take, and how does that phrase sort of land with you, and how does it resonate?
Sure, I think it's well, I think it's a neat title anyway. But I think I'm sure you planned it like this, and that knowing you a little bit, over the years, there's a few different meanings to that phrase. I think that the idea of mindfulness being something that those of us in the field have been aware of for a long time, but it's just now coming into the, I think, popular media. Anyway, there's a lot more people talking about mindfulness. So I think Conversations with the Mind could have that idea. Like when you're having a conversation, are you truly engaged in that conversation and really mindful of what's happening in that conversation? Just a little riff on that. I had a coworker that was asking me, "Hey man, can you explain this mindfulness thing?" And I said, "Sure, man. Let's just kind of talk through it and I'll answer any questions you have." And he's like, "Well, I just don't understand what it is." I said, "It's kind of this idea of sort of being present and being conscious of your presence and aware of." And as I'm saying this, he's like picking up his cell phone, checking his email. Kind of what you're not doing right now. And he's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "This is going to take longer than I thought." So I think mindfulness as a term, as a practice, has been around for longer than me and you, I think. But as a term, I think, when I hear something like Conversations with the Mind, I think my mind kind of goes there. I also think it's fun to kind of have this back and forth between two colleagues in that, like, as you mentioned, that world of psychology and performance enhancement and really are engaging the mind of our performers and of our clients, and really getting them to either have that conversation with themselves or with us in practice. So yeah, I guess that's kind of where my mind goes when thinking about the title.
Nice. I love that. And yeah, it's meant to, I picked the title because it's meant to, it could split off in any number of directions and have any sort of meaning for a lot of people. I like how you said, we've had, those of us in the field, we've had an understanding of what mindfulness is for a long time. And even before I became a practicing clinician, I studied mindfulness through Buddhist practices and things like that. So it's difficult to, number one, it's difficult to explain mindfulness to people sometimes when they don't understand, and it's oftentimes easier to explain it through the route of pointing out an example of what mindfulness is not. So I usually, everybody has the experience of driving from their house to like another location and not remembering how they got there. So pointing out that, oh yeah, you have those experiences, and that's the opposite of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to engage every moment so you remember the trip or the journey along the way. Mm-hmm. But I like, it's difficult sometimes to separate ourselves from, because mindfulness is becoming like a buzzword and becoming more mainstream. it's difficult for us as professionals who work with the mind to separate ourselves from people who don't have the experience or the training, and just kind of put themselves out there as self-help gurus or life coaches or things like that. Do you find it difficult to navigate that space too? And I feel like when people in the general public like ask me what is mindfulness, I have to ask them, like, are you looking for the guru answer? Or are you looking for like the scientific, or are you looking for the spiritual answer? Because I think that they all have differences, but they intersect as well.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. I do. I mean, like that coworker is not clinically trained, psychologically trained, more of a finance guy. And I think, like you said, the term itself has become more mainstream. So I think like I've been fielding more questions about, do you do mindfulness and can you teach that? And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of what we do. Like that's kind of what, just even in sort of the one-on-one everyday counseling sessions, I think we're allowing people to experience, like you said, that moment to moment of being in the room, present with each other, and really kind of having that relational experience. And I see that as practicing mindfulness, giving the student, in my case, the student athletes, or in our case, our clients or performers, whomever we work with, that opportunity to have that moment in the session. And so it's interesting, like you said, it has hit the mainstream, and people are sort of like, oh, mindfulness this and mindfulness that. And for those of us who have been in practice for a while, we're like, yeah, it's kind of what we do. And not to downplay it or not to delineate the importance of it, but that might not be the right word. Sorry. Diminish the importance of it, I guess, is probably a better way to say it, because I do think it's incredibly important, and it is a skill, and it is something that truly needs to be practiced. And so I think it is, at times I find it somewhat frustrating when folks sort of jump on that popular media bandwagon and sort of try to step into a space where maybe they're not really qualified to be. And the irony in my brain is that I'm like, hey, you got to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, you talk about mindfulness as being a skill, and I agree with you. I for sure think it's a trainable skill, but it's interesting to just think about how our ancestors were, when we were cavemen and living on the plains and worried about survival day to day. It felt like mindfulness wasn't really a skill as much as it was a way of being. That was just your that was your default mode network, was being mm-hmm. mindfully present all the time because there's predators everywhere. And now we think we're more connected with our new modern technology, and we think we're more able to have free time to be present in our lives, but it seems like we're more distracted and less connected to the present moment, given that like our survival needs are already taken care of. Or, we find ourselves wandering off into social media space and these different alternate realities that we've created through our systems and things like that. It's interesting how now it is a skill. And if you don't, if we haven't used it for many generations, now we have to like almost retrain this thing that almost was natural back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. As you were saying that, I was kind of thinking about that Jungian idea of the collective unconscious. Like if based on that evolutionary take that you just mentioned, in theory then, through Jung's philosophy, we all have it, right? It's part of us, that ability to be mindful, because we've all had that shared history, if you will. But I think you're exactly right. I think that is, in and of itself, the issue is that the more connected we are, and it's a theoretical connectedness, I think, the more avenues we have to connect to one another, the less sort of able we are to actually connect, I think. Yeah, I think I'm a fan of people connecting, and social media is fine. And I think it's like every other part of our functioning, is that when it becomes problematic, we have to be, to borrow a term, we have to be mindful of that, and we have to be aware of it. And I get worried, like you were saying, those individuals who kind of, drift off into that social media world, and stay disconnected from the present moment. I think you're right. I think it's almost this weird paradoxical kind of thing. The more we evolve, the less we're connected, or something like that.
Yeah, the more we technologically evolve, maybe. But you've got to see that, and that's got to be an interesting factor for you with the NCAA athletes that you work with. I think more than the average person, the NCAA athletes' life, future career is based a lot on social media presence and how much they engage with their fans and how much they are living in these manufactured realities off to the side, and how do we, it's a very interesting challenge for you. How do you teach an athlete to engage more and be more present with themselves, while also understanding that, hey, like the person with the most followers might have a better chance of getting drafted next year because they're getting better exposure? And how do you teach an athlete to find the balance between, yes, this social media stuff is important for your future, but also like you need to tune into what's going on up here in your mind if you're going to perform your best on that any given day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is one of the bigger challenges these days, is how do you sort of turn it off and turn it on in terms of awareness, conscious awareness, mindfulness. I think you're exactly right that a number of the athletes that we see that come through are already, I forget what the little thing on media is when you get like the blue ribbon, it means you're legitimate or something. They'll come into college with that level of accomplishment, if you will, that's a loose use of that word, but they'll come in and they're essentially brand managers now of their own brand, of themselves as a brand. And I think too, like you said, like you mentioned, that 16 to 25-year-old brain is not fully myelinated, is not, and especially towards the early end of that 16 to 18, when they're just getting started, to be able to understand the impact of what they're doing then and how that can impact their future earnings or their future career possibilities, and being careful as to who you let into that world and what you say. And here in Colorado now with one of the, I think it's the Denver mayoral's race, the challenger is being criticized because of her social media accounts and some things she said. And a lot of times I think when we dig into that stuff, you look back and it's years ago, and people understanding, that stuff will come back and bite you if you're not careful. So it is tough for those of us that are less relevant generationally, in terms of the student athletes that are coming in, to say, hey, look, you got to be careful with this stuff. You really got to be a brand manager early on. You need to legitimize your followers. You need to follow, make sure you're following the right people and making the right decisions. And, by the way, have some fun.
Mm-hmm. So there's a way, it doesn't have to be one or the other, but more, you can engage mindfulness and teach mindfulness in the office first, have them apply it out on the field so that they know that it works for their athletics, but then also let them know that mindfulness works in every aspect of their life, not just athletics, but academics and test taking, as well as, mindfully engaging with social media and knowing who you're surrounding yourself with and making these conscious decisions rather than just willy-nilly clicking like on all these things that could come to bite you back in the butt.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really interesting. you're talking about branding with NCAA too, and this has been something that I think has been a topic of contention for a long time. I remember learning about this in my my master's program for sports psych, but talking about how a university owns the NCAA athletes' identity, pretty much owns their brand as they're going through the school, because they're a non-paid athlete. Well, non-paid, they're getting a full scholarship a lot of times, but that the university owns the image. They're the ones profiting off of all of the marketing and the posters and things like that. When these kids, and I think it's wise that you're letting them know right now, like, hey, you're building your brand on the side too, outside of NCAA, but how do they navigate that while they're building their own brand, and yet NCAA kind of owns their brand and isn't paying them for any of their branding stuff? I don't even know if NCAA athletes are allowed to seek outside sponsorship or outside funding in any way. I don't think they're allowed to, are they?
Sorry, they can have an outside job. They can't use their likeness as for instance, in my case, as a CU athlete to make money. So they can't take their jersey out and go sign autographs for $5 a pop or anything like that. They can have a job, and the hang up there though is with what time. So there's only 168 hours a week, and for many of them, 140-ish are planned, 100, 120, 140. So yeah, I think a lot of them don't have an opportunity to work. And I do know this is a recent development, but the NCAA has created I think it's a working group or a task force or something on the naming rights issue. Naming, licensing, and branding, I think is what it's called. And the athletic director at CU is actually on that committee. So it'll be super interesting to see what comes out of that, kind of exactly to your point. Will they start letting athletes take advantage of that naming? Do the student athletes really understand what they're signing when they sign some of them at 14 or 16 years old? They sign to come to a school. Do they understand that the school can put their likeness on everything, and they don't necessarily get more scholarship for it? Yeah, and then that gets into the whole debate of paying players and all that stuff. And I think in talking with some business folks over the years, if the NCAA allowed schools to pay their players, it would pretty much be the end of most intercollegiate athletics, because there's just not money in it. It's not a huge money maker in general. There's about, I would guess, maybe in the dozen range, maybe 15 university athletic departments that actually make money every year. A bunch of them are in the Southeast Conference. So yeah, it's just such a nuanced and hugely deep issue, all tied together, right? So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what this working group comes out with and how they're starting to handle this naming rights thing, because I think that my take is that the social media presence of a number of our student athletes is a response to that. It's like, well, fine, I can't make money, then I'm going to at least have my brand out there. People are going to know me. Mm-hmm. So that if I do decide that the coaches at X school are not nice and I want to transfer to Y school, then, my 20,000 followers, 200,000 followers, million followers are going to know that. And that's brand damaging potentially to that X institution. I don't know that they think about it like that, but yeah, it's an interesting piece.
Yeah. And yeah, it is interesting. And to someone on the outside, I don't work in a university setting. I work with a couple of university athletes, but not with the systems in the universities. And from someone from the outside, I'm up here in Fort Collins at Colorado State University, and they just got a huge brand new stadium on campus. And it's hard to look at that being built for what some would say is not a very good football team. And, and it seems like these universities are making billions off of their athletes with all the apparel and everything like that. And maybe I just don't know the insides of where the funding is coming from. Maybe it's from alumni donations and things like that. But it just seems like they're taking in a lot of money and not putting it back into what is making them the money in the first place, which is the athletes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting. University of Texas, maybe 4 years ago now, 3-4 years ago, sort of they tried to figure out, all right, with all the money that we spend on athletes, how can we sort of say this is how much we spend per athlete? So what they did is they took like coaching salaries, they took tutor costs, academic, if they're sending somebody to school, how much does that cost? How much does a position like mine cost where they get free counseling? I think like nutritional stuff, I think they took everything that they offered to their student athletes, and they figured out that they spend per student athlete $250,000 per year per student athlete. So I think it's one of those things where you're right. And even when I saw that number, I was like, whoa. I think you're right. On the outside, it's not a very transparent system. Intercollegiate athletics, I don't think, in general. And even those of us who work in it, don't have a lot of knowledge of where the money goes and that kind of thing. And I do think there is still that arms race mentality of, well, CU just built a new athletic administration building. Colorado State's got to step it up and build a new stadium. And they sort of are prop bets almost, or that's probably not the right word, especially since we're talking about NCAA athletics. But it's sort of they're betting that the future is going to be better than the present. And so, and a lot of that, I know that the on-campus stadium for CSU means the CU-CSU rivalry can go back to an on-campus rivalry versus being played in Denver, which means that the home campus keeps more of their money that they bring in for that game. They don't have to pay the stadium fee and all that other stuff that they have to pay. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an ongoing conversation that has to be had in terms of my contention for a long time on this is like, we pay the athletes, we just tell them how they have to spend their money. And that's, that's the way I've chosen to think about it. I've talked to some athletes about it specifically, and they seem to be, yeah, I could see that. Excuse me. And then some others just don't, they're either not on scholarship or they're not on enough to sort of to justify the amount of time they're spending. So it really does become like, why am I doing this? And I really love to do this sport, whether that's, Colorado just is sending in 2 weeks, like 13, I think, student athletes to national championships for track. And I don't know of any track person that's on a full scholarship, so it's a labor of love for them for sure. And for a number of our sports, but I think the ones that get most of the publicity, men's football, men's and women's basketball, you do have a lot of those questions of like, how much are we making on ticket sales? How much are we making on, popcorn sales? Something relatively simple, but concessions and tickets. And then I think that brings up the issue of how much are we paying our coaches? Mm-hmm. I think Nick Saban now makes over $9 million a year or something, I heard. I don't know if that's accurate, but, we could Google it real quick and figure it out. And he's got some clause in his contract, I think, where, he is the highest paid coach in the country. So anytime any other coach gets a raise up to his level, he automatically gets a raise.
That's a hell of a negotiating contract point.
I know. I'm like, how do I do that? But and that's a big question too. And I think, and forget the numbers again, it's like 32 or 39 states, the highest paid public employee is the football coach at the university. So they're making more than the governors, and they're making more than the university presidents, and so it's a big business. And you're right, it's $1 billion industry. And figuring out how that trickles down to the student athletes is an issue far above my pay grade.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say not only throwing out that big number, $250,000 a year per athlete, but that makes sense. I mean, when I was going to CU, I saw how well the university took care of their student athletes. They had their own, equipment facility and their own dining hall with top-notch 5-star food, and everything's taken care of pretty well. I actually thought about, I was never a student athlete when I did my undergrad, so I'll be starting a PhD in the fall here at CSU, and I was thinking, since I never played as an undergrad, could I do college sports now in my mid-30s through a PhD program? And looked it up on NCAA. It looks like that's not going to happen for me. It only works for undergrads.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, is once you enroll in school, your clock starts and you get 5 years. And so, I think a lot of people miss out on that opportunity because they're not really thinking about it. But actually, CU, their place kicker is he's 32 years old. He's a junior, so he's an Australian guy, and didn't even start college until he was 30 or 29 or something. And so, and then you see teams out like BYU and some of the guys on Utah's team, if they're LDS, then they will go on their mission before they even enroll in college. So they'll come back to college kind of in their mid-20s. And it's an interesting rule system. It's an interesting governing body. I don't even want to consider what the president of the NCAA has to go through, but yeah, that would be kind of cool though, to see you back on the field.
Yeah. Well, since it's been a while since we chatted, but I think since last time we chatted, I've turned professional in one of my sports. So I turned pro in jiu-jitsu, I think a year and a half ago, something like that. And that doesn't, just because I am professional doesn't mean that I get paid, to do it that much. I get paid a little bit, but not that much. So it's just more of like an honorary type title, but it's still something I never thought I would accomplish. It's not something that I really tried to become, but just sticking with something that I loved. And like you said, a labor of love. I just did it because I loved it, and it turned out to be something dream fulfilling almost. But I want to switch gears just a little bit and ask you, how did your interest in the mind come about in the first place? How did you get interested in wanting to explore, your inner, I like to call it your inner verse instead of your universe or your outer verse. So, well, how did you get into it?
That's a great question, man. I think, I was how long we got? But
we got a while.
I was an athlete kind of my whole life. Like, I started playing sports when I was 4 and loved it. Just loved competing and loved playing and didn't really love practicing. But then in like 7th grade, 6th, 7th grade, started getting into music. And in 7th grade, joined the band. And my band director, even in 7th grade, was kind of like, man, there's something here. You could be really good at this if you wanted to. So I think between, musical performance and athletic performance, you sort of spend some time in your head anyway, in your inner verse, as you call it. I think most people do that. But I remember having conversations with myself on the football field or the soccer field, or even in band practice or in band performance, and so I think even back then, that 7th and 8th grade kid that didn't know his butt from a hole in the ground, was still sort of getting into that exploration of the mind, not knowing that's what it was. So then went into high school as a band person, sort of dropped competitive athletics at that point. I still played athletics, but more in that recreational space. But really was dedicated to music. And so the more I got into that musical performance arena, I started realizing, hey, there's some other things that go on. It's not just playing the notes on the page and putting the air through the horn. Like, I was a sax player. And so I think, again, in the high school, I took my first psychology class just as a high school junior or senior, I think. And I was like, man, this is really fascinating. So it started to sort of pull everything together at that point, the athletic performance, musical performance, even academic performance, and then into this idea of the exploration of the mind. And so still went into college thinking that I was going to go into music somehow, like be a band director, be a music producer, something along those lines. And I don't know if it's because I discovered college life, but musical practice sort of fell off. I was never a real super intense practice person. I had taken advantage of some talent, and and so one of my professors at the end of my first year was like, "You sure you want to do this music thing?" I was kind of like, I think so. He's like, "Maybe you look at something else." And I was like, I had this like existential crisis all of a sudden where I'm like, I don't think I'm good at anything else.
And now you're being told that you're not good at this thing by your teacher.
Yeah, exactly. It was the only thing I was ever good at. And so I think, that transition piece is huge for athletes and everybody really, but so I think just age kind of helped with some of that discovery of the mind. And then, when I got more into the formalized training as an undergrad psych major, still didn't really know what I was doing or why I was doing it. I was kind of going through classes to get out. And then I had an advisor that was like, you only have like 3 semesters till you graduate. What are you going to do? It's like, what am I supposed to do? And she goes, well, grad school's an option. It's like, that could be cool. And I'd done some research in like cognitive development and little kids and some ADHD kinds of stuff that was like getting me interested in how the mind, especially of kids, develops. Because you'd see kids that are trying to sit still in this ADHD clinic and just couldn't do it. And it had nothing to do with what all the adults were telling them. Like they wanted to pay attention and listen and follow directions, and they just couldn't. So then just recognizing, hey, there's other things at play here. There's other parts of us developing. Getting into I got into a master's program and I studied hormones and behavior. So that started to make even more sense. Okay, there's these chemicals floating around up there that are really hugely influential in what we do. My advisor was also my professor one year, and she had us as our final exam. She said, tap your finger on the desk and then tell me what just happened. So we had to explain all the neurons and all the different chemical systems. And that stuff was cool. And I was impressed with how much I retained, to be honest. But that stuff was neat. But it was, again, that little insight into like, hey, there's something else going on here. There's something beyond like conscious awareness. Because, again, when you tap your finger on a desk and you think about, and you have to stop and consciously think about all the different things that had to happen in a microsecond to get that to happen. That's like, I don't know, man. I got really into that. Like I got super jazzed thinking about that stuff.
So at this point, are you more interested in pursuing psychology to figure yourself out and figure your own mind out and how things are working? Or are you more interested and focused on how the psychology and of these disordered brains are working in youth development?
Yeah, I think at that point, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle where I'm enjoying the research aspect of things, the research component. I hadn't taken like a psycho pharmacology class or any sort of psychopathology classes. I don't think I had maybe one as an undergrad. So the sort of deep disorder kind of things, I think that's when it all started to come together, honestly, where you have these hormones that are relegating your motor behavior, but they can also influence your mood. Excuse me, and you can alter those by other substances you introduce into your brain. Caffeine, weed, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, whatever, right? Even sugar, right? It influences all these sort of chemical things. So I think I don't know, man. That's a really good question. I think it's probably, it's probably dancing around the middle. Like I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And then that advisor and I would always talk about sports anyway. And she was like, you ever heard of sports psychology? I was like, no. And this is like 2000. So it's not, I mean, it's not that long ago. And in the history of sports psychology, it's a pretty good, I mean, sports psychology got a pretty robust history at this point. And so I sort of should have heard about it at this point, I think. But anyway, and it wasn't until my PhD program that I really got into talking with other people about their issues and concerns and problems and being helpful and having that sort of one-on-one interchange. I mean, at this point in my master's degree, I was still just doing research. I was teaching. I mean, I was loving that world. And then, honestly, I think when I looked at PhD programs, similar to what you and I have talked about, is that I really think a PhD program is a place where you develop a philosophy. And I know it's a doctorate of philosophy, and people think of that, oh, that's more research versus applied, and this, that, the other. I said, I think, too, it's the highest degree awarded by a university. And my take on that is that you're sort of supposed to have this philosophy on what you're doing when you get done. And that really sort of started opening up my mind to my own experience and then to that of others. So I don't know if it was just a morbid intellectual curiosity thing that got me into this, but the more I learned about it, the more I read about it, some existential psychology books. Irvin Yalom was a huge influence on some of my thinking around this stuff.
What does he write about?
He has a couple textbooks on existential psychology. He writes on group psychotherapy. He's a psychiatrist by practice, but he writes as a therapist. He's old school in that. I was back as a psychiatrist when you were trained as a therapist as well. You didn't just hand out meds every 15 minutes. But he wrote, I might have it right here, actually. It's like called An Open Letter to a Young Therapist. And it's a book, just a short book. You and I have talked about this. I don't read much, ironically enough, or as much as I probably think I could benefit from. But he writes about all the mistakes he made as a young therapist. And it's this way of sort of connecting those of us who are young therapists, and at the time I was a very young therapist, a way of connecting, I think, our inner experience with the idea that it's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to make a mistake. And for a lot of us, I think, that get into this field, dare I say yourself included, we tend to be perfectionistic and we tend to be very driven. And we don't like to mess up. We don't like to make mistakes. And the more I think you can understand that mistakes are part of it and they're learning opportunities, they're not bad things, so he's writing about this kind of stuff as I'm going through this transition in my PhD program. And so, that started to really open up my mind to being connected both to myself and then helping my clients connect to their inner experience as well, their inner verse.
Yeah, I have to say, and I'm getting better at talking about my own path in this way, but I'm pretty certain that my path towards exploring the mind and my interest in psychology purely developed out of a selfish interest to know myself in the deepest way possible. And it developed out of not so much sports, but a desire to want to be a Navy SEAL, an elite operator when I was in high school. And trying to develop, seeing people like that and looking up to people like that who had such control over their mind and their mental discipline and mental toughness and resiliency. They could put themselves through superhuman feats that most people would quit. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to know how I could tap into that resource that's in me. I just had to figure out how to get to it. And so for me, like, psychology became this path of self-discovery largely, and it's still continued. That's why I say, I hate to admit this, but my path to psychology, even today, and going into a social work PhD program, is still very selfish. I still am doing this because I want to know myself better, because by knowing myself better, it makes me better able to help others. And that's sort of like a side bonus, is helping others for me. Because in the end, I only have my experience, I only have my life, I only have my connection to myself, and that relationship and understanding of who I am internally and externally, and with my identity and all these things. I think that's the thing that we all need to focus the most on, is developing our self and our inner verse. And then it seems to make it easier to help other people through that. It's almost like we have to figure out the answers to our own struggles and our own issues. And then by doing that, it makes us better clinicians. And I know this directly from being an ex-addict and an alcoholic, and having gone through treatment programs. The one that your wife works at through Cedar, I went through there, and that was the beginning of my recovery journey. And by going through that and experiencing what works and what didn't work, that informs me and makes me better able to help other people with their own addiction issues even today. Having overcome injuries in athletics, and having overcome struggles with family addiction and identity issues when injured, and all these things. I think all that's really important. And I'm really looking forward to the PhD program. I like the way you talk about it, about forming your philosophy. And I'm starting to see, I haven't even started the program yet, but I'm starting to just hear from the director and some of the professors that, this is totally different than undergraduate or master's, where you're just learning information. And now this is going to be more like self-directed, self-guided. Like, they want you to pick something that you're interested in and learn every single thing you can about it, and then try and make a contribution to the field and put your stamp on it, and sort of ride that wave. And I'm really excited to be able to form my own philosophy. I hope to get into talking to you about some of my interests moving forward in that program. But I want to hear from you too. Like, what are some of your favorite theories of the mind or theories of consciousness that you came across, or that you embody today? I mean, I feel like a lot of people engage consciousness and think about it in their own way. Like, I take a Buddhist lens, and I almost take a lens that this is all a matrix or a simulation that we're all in, and asking those existential questions of, well, then why are we here, and what is the purpose of work? And so what is your take on consciousness and your favorite theories?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons that you and I connected was the similarities there. Like, I've never studied Buddhism, but I think from what I've gathered from individuals over the years that I've interacted with, it makes a lot of sense in my brain. And I think the existential piece too. I think I like working with all my clients. I like working with anybody with any sort of struggle or performance enhancement challenge or whatever it is. And my absolute favorite are the ones who have that really existential understanding of self. And I think I would say I think you're probably right in that. For me, those clients become a selfish endeavor, in that by talking with them and about existential issues and existential concerns, I get rewarded, like, personally, because I can answer my own sort of existential wonderings. I can let my mind sort of go, if you will. It's not, at that point, it's not about coming up with a good performance strategy to overcome some free throw issues or the yips in golf. It's really about, like, getting down below the surface of what consciousness is, and what, I mean, like you said, what are we all doing here? That kind of question. So I really like that stuff. I think, man, yeah, I'd have to say, honestly, I wouldn't consider myself a Freudian or a Jungian, but the psychodynamic, I think I kind of got my start in that area of, like, looking back, and then, I've mixed in so my partner you mentioned, she's actually at Denver Women's Recovery now. She's the clinical director there, but she was at Cedar, and then she worked previously when we were in Oklahoma. She worked for a Native American nation. And, in incorporating some of the Native American teachings that she was sort of educated on herself, just through working there and working with different Native American So their clinic there served like 7 different nations. So, a bunch of different smaller nations that, so it really sort of incorporating some of that into my own work. And I think you say it correctly in that, I think when we work on ourselves, we work on others as well. And to me, the relationship part, and I know I'm bouncing all over the place with your question, but, so we've got sort of this psychodynamic influence, this feminist influence. One of my professors actually in grad school was like, I think you're a feminist. I'm like, huh, I would have never felt that, but all right. Sort of some feminist influences, some Native American influences, and then just my own, like, you read something, you sort of incorporate it into what makes sense in your brain. You read something else, and so I don't know at this point, I think it's a fully integrated, like you said, it's a fully integrated approach to my own experiences through life, right? And I've got a few years on you, so there's that. The age thing, I think, is part of it. So yeah, man, I mean, I feel like I'm kind of all over the board at this point, but I think that's what I think.
So, so far with all your experiences, all your education, all your various interests, explorations into the mind, from different reading sources and things you've learned, what do you come away with so far? And I'm sure your concept of this is going to change over time, as it usually does. But with all that, what is your concept of like what this is all about? Like, what are we here to? These are the questions that I'm often asking myself. What am I here to learn? What is this reality trying to teach me? What are, how do I better connect with what's real, and how do I discern what's real and what's a projection? So for you, like you said, you have a few more years under your belt, and you have a PhD and a lot more career experience, and working with athletes and other minds and consciousness. What are some of the conclusions, or the conclusions you're starting to work with or come to around this?
Yeah, I think, now granted, I'm biased because all of my training is in the field of psychology, which means the person, the individual, right? And I think social work is maybe a step towards the group versus the individual. Sociology is the group. You have like social psychology, which kind of mixes the social work, sociology, psychology thing. And I think you have anthropology, which is cultures and groups, right? Like, so I'm biased, and I think for me, it is about that individual experience. It's also about the relational experiences that we all have. The longer I am, the more I put importance in relationships and in frankly in trust. And that is Eric Erickson was a developmental psych guy, and he had this sort of the stage of conflicts, right? And the very first one he talks about is trust versus mistrust. And this is happening before we're a year old. Like when you're a baby, you cry, does somebody come take care of you? And if they do, then you, in theory, develop trust for others. If they don't, then you develop more of a non-trust of others. So I think stuff like that has influenced me, but I think it is about, I think it's about our relationships with others. And again, chosen profession and training all leads me to that. And so I'm biased in that way, but I do think, change in our lives comes through the use of our relationships with others, and even the recognition of our pattern of behaviors, right, is something that's relational in nature, and whether that's relational to yourself. So, I've gone down this path before, and I didn't like how that ended last time, so I need to make a conscious effort and bring it back to mindfulness thing, right, to be present, to be aware of my decision-making or my choices in those moments is hugely important. So I'm kind of in that place now. And then having a kid a couple years ago, you know, it really kind of, it challenges all these philosophies, you know, because you can't, you know, you don't want to be like your parents, but most of us think we turned out all right despite what we've gone through. So they didn't do bad things, you know, even if they did bad things, we've overcome them at this point, blah, 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 blah. So, yeah.
Yeah. So this idea of relationship, I really like it. We were talking about this in the last podcast. I had a friend of mine on, and that's what he's finding too in his spiritual journey as a medicine man / shaman. He's finding that relationship is the thing that keeps coming up in his psyche as things he needs to work on. But I totally agree with you. I think relationship is super important, not only because it helps bond us to other people, which is really important as a social species, but learning to navigate relationship with others also informs us in how we have relation to ourselves as well. Mm-hmm. And but I want to take it one step further too and ask you, you know, and maybe this is where your bias as a psychologist is coming through, but you talk a lot about relationship to other person. What about relationship to other things? So relationship to our environment, relationship to plant life, to animal life, relationship to the cosmos, relationship to, you know, the ocean and systems like that. What do you think about bringing relationship and talking about relationship in this way for personal growth? I feel like that has some sort of factor into, it's got to factor into part of like why we're here and what we're trying to learn, or else it wouldn't, you know, maybe it wouldn't exist. It's got to be there for a reason. We're learning something from it.
Right. Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think I'll have to go back and check out that podcast from your previous guest as well, because that part is fascinating to me, I think, as well. You're right. Sort of all my training and all my day-to-day work is one-on-one individual. And I think, you know, when we talk to individuals who are struggling in the psychological world, a lot of what we encourage or what we can encourage is that connection to something else, whether it's a higher power in terms of a spiritual sense, whether it's taking a walk and having that, as you mentioned, that connection to nature. I'm forgetting the theorist, but they have this theory of multiple intelligences, and it's not the big one. It's like there's like eight or nine intelligences. I want to say it's maybe Gardner or something like that. I'm blanking on the author's name, but some of their the idea is that, you know, intelligence isn't just one thing. And the multiple intelligences idea in that theory, the theory of 8 or 9, it used to be 8, I think it's 9 now, or it's 7 now, 8 something. Apologize for you allowing you to hear my inner dialogue. But one of those intelligences is nature. One is interpersonal, one is intrapersonal. You know, so I think all those things are really important, especially when psychologically we're struggling with either where we are physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You know, when we can tap into those other intelligences and those other understandings of how the world is or how the world can be, and being in a place like Colorado is really perfect for that, because I think you can sort of, you know, how many people look at the mountains and wonder and sort of see them for their beauty, but then wonder, like, how did that happen? You know, and then you get into plate tectonics. But, you know, my sister-in-law is very religious and spiritual, and she's like, God made those. And I'm like, okay, we'll go with that, you know, and just, I mean, just that exploration of just different explanations of one phenomenon, I think is really, really important. And like you said, I think, again, I think you can use the term relationship to mean relation to other people, places, things. Yeah.
Or even relationship to a certain worldview or story that you hold about yourself or about the world. I think that story, that perception can be changed. And that's something that I really like about the work we do and the psychology that we do. And again, for selfish reasons, I got into sports psychology so that I could learn how to be a better athlete myself. I wanted to know how to master my own mind so that I would have an advantage over my opponents. And it turned into, oh wait, now I can help other people with this. But that's another thing that I don't always see in our field. And I'm interested to hear your perception of it too, is that I don't always see people actually practicing what they preach and what they teach. And I feel very strongly, I try not to teach anybody any techniques or suggest that they do anything unless I've tried it myself and it's worked for me, even if, I might show them some research or something, but, usually I speak from experience more so than I do from like a scientific minded place. I'm curious of your thoughts on that, as well as, what are some of your current personal mental performance practices?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put that. I do think working with athletes and knowing athletes on that sort of different level, a lot of them are experiential learners. And I think that using examples from our own life, in terms of the teaching behind that, a lot of people are like, you got to keep your distance and don't share stories of your own life. And I think for some individuals, it's really important to share that. Hey, look, I tried this, or I used to do that, and then it worked for me. And so that might be something you want to try. I think that helps them feel reassured. And that, we're not necessarily in the reassurance business, but
for instance, like how can you teach mindfulness if you don't practice mindfulness yourself? You might have a book knowledge of it, but it's totally different than having experienced it yourself and having been in a flow state. You're better able to describe a flow state than just having read it from a book,
Yep. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, again, that's where sometimes age comes into play. But again, in your case as well, having been an athlete or athletically involved for as long as you have, it allows you to relate to those clients on that level. I had a professor in grad school that used to say that you shouldn't never consult with a sport that you never played. And I was like, ooh. I didn't like the way that sat. One, because I think I was at the time consulting with a volleyball team and I never played volleyball. So I was like, so I think there's kind of there's again, that universal experience of the athlete where it's like, what I used to get, and personally, I had a lot of pre-performance anxiety, both in music and in athletics. And so, being able to tell somebody a deep breathing relaxation sort of approach can be really helpful right before performance is not because it's written in the book that way. It's because I did it, or I didn't do it. Or I didn't do it until later in my athletic career, my academic career. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's one of those coaching things of like, I'm not going to ask them, or maybe a manager thing too, right? Like, I'm not going to ask somebody to do something I wouldn't do.
Yeah. So lead from the front rather than leading from the back and saying, do what I say, not what I do. I'm more inclined to say, let me show you the way by leading by example, so I'm not going to say, to my clients, you should be meditating on a daily basis for 5 minutes if I'm not doing that myself. Right. I feel like it's being hypocritical a bit. It's like having an overweight personal trainer. You want a personal trainer who has a fitness physique that you appreciate.
I'd rather have an overweight chef.
Yeah, there you go. Someone who knows how to eat. So, what are some of your current mental optimization strategies that you use in your work or in your daily life?
My stuff is back to the basics, man. I still love good goal setting. I still love meditation. Well, I've gotten into meditation recently, honestly. And I think I probably practiced meditation and mindfulness without being aware that I was without labeling it that. I'm a big fan of relaxation strategies, deep breathing. I mean, honestly, for me, it's the simple stuff, because that's the stuff that really in my world, lays the groundwork for what I do on the day to day. Like, it allows me to that, if I'm at home, if I've got my list of to-do things, for instance, then I can leave that list at home and I can go be fully engaged with my clients one-on-one. If I'm sitting in my office with a client and I'm thinking, oh man, I got to remember to go to the grocery store, and I got to remember to get this and that and the other thing, and then I got to get out of here because I got to pick up a kid from school, right? If I have that sort of articulated in my goals list or in my schedule for the day, or something like that, then I can be fully engaged with that client and those clients that I see on that day.
So optimizing your schedule and your environment so that you can facilitate more presence in everyday life. I like that. What about, do you find yourself using things like, well, you mentioned the relaxation and the breathing. I'm sure with a 3-year-old daughter, you have to engage deep breathing and stress reduction techniques quite often. And these are things, these are foundational skills that we teach to our clients and our athletes, is arousal regulation. So, do you find yourself using techniques like that to bring yourself down when your 3-year-old is making you want to pull your hair out?
Yeah.
Worked.
Yeah, definitely. Right. And I think it's one of those things where, again, as you mentioned, having the book knowledge of, oh, this is how this is supposed to work, versus in that moment when you recognize like you're starting to get very upset with a 3-year-old who doesn't understand logic, can be a very helpful technique to just slow down for a second. And I find that we're even trying to teach her to do that stuff, even though she's 3 and she has the T-shirt that says, it's one of those keep calm and carry on kind of deals that says, I can't keep calm, I'm only 3. So even in that moment, even understanding that her brain is not necessarily ready for this kind of stuff, it's when she gets upset or affected by something, it's helping her articulate that. And again, like you said, there's some selfishness to that. One, it stops the whining and the crying and the things that I can't control, and I have my own control issues. But it also reminds me, hey, when she'll say, like, if I get loud over something, she'll say, I don't like that, Daddy. And I'm like, okay, I could go off right now, or I could say there's something in my tone that is not landing the way I want it to, right? And to just have that existential, if you will, experience, or that mindful experience, to be like, okay, I didn't think I was being loud. Clearly she does, or she doesn't like something about my tone. And she's, she's not able to say, your tone's a little harsh today. I don't know what's going on for you, but let's talk about, she can't do that, but I can, so it's an opportunity for me to have that moment of personal growth while trying to teach her about moments of personal growth.
Do you find that because you have been studying the mind for so long and been studying psychology, that it makes you maybe gives you a little leg up in ability to parent, or an ability to understand the psychology of a 3-year-old? Whereas, I'm thinking, a lot of the clients that I see at the addiction clinic are parents too, but a lot of them are high school educated, maybe at best. And so I see that their parenting skills are not necessarily that effective, or, they don't have this awareness and this mindfulness that you're talking about around interactions with their kids. It's just kind of like they have an emotional outburst or reaction to it, and it makes them less effective. So do you feel that knowing the developmental psychology piece and knowing a little bit about why humans do the things they do at different developmental stages, do you feel like it makes you a better parent?
I guess we'll see is probably my best answer. I think being a parent gives me a newfound respect for parents, and at any level of education or at any age, just understanding, like, again, that the the practice of mindfulness and mindful awareness and presentness and existential exploration, it helps at, back when she was a tiny tot and, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and it's my turn to get up and rock her back to sleep. And you have the one side of your mind that's like, oh my God, just go back to sleep. Just don't even do, and the other side's like, okay, what can we learn tonight? What can we get out of this? And we being she and I, right? Like that relational piece. Like if she can understand that, like I was saying about the Erickson stuff, like if she can understand that, I'm going to come get you, or your mom's going to come get you, and we're going to be with you. Like we can't fix this. We can't make you burp or whatever all the time, but we're going to be with you while it happens. And so maybe the sort of advanced age thing helps with that. I don't know, man. Jokingly, Letitia and I say that we have a college fund and a therapy fund, because 2 psychologists as parents, you never know, right?
That's hilarious, because we hear horror stories, or we see in movies, horror stories of a kid who has a psychiatrist or a psychologist as a parent, and they can't get anything past them because the parent already knows everything and knows why the kid is acting the way they are. I think that's hilarious.
Yeah, the Big Bang Theory has shown us a lot.
Yeah. So for the audience who might not be familiar with who you are, could you maybe talk a little bit about what you do for a profession at CU?
Yeah. My day job, as I call it, is I'm a psychologist and a mental performance consultant. And most of what I do is just one-on-one counseling with individuals. My clientele is restricted to the NCAA student athletes at CU, but in my private practice world, I'll see, honestly, I'm pretty much restricted to athletes these days. I don't have a budding private practice in terms of individual clients. I do work with a couple of the USA teams, USA Boxing, USA Men's Cricket in particular, and that's more tends to be more performance work and more like early developmental, like how do you tap into the mental processes that are going on. So back to our discussion about mindfulness and existentialism, but doing it in a way that the challenge there is doing it in a way that a very, very, very accomplished athletes can get on board with and understand that this is really helpful, especially as we build towards these Olympic years. So for boxing, 2020, 2024, 2028, and men's cricket is shooting for 2028. So, there's a long build there versus sort of a short build with the boxers. And so that's some of that's less daily and more weekly or monthly work in that realm. But the other stuff I get to do is work with some of the teams at CU on team culture and team development. And again, I rely on that relational approach, that present-focused place. I do good work with some coaches and administrators and other staff members on various aspects of the student-athlete experience, whether it's coming into the university, transition out of the university, any struggles they may have while they're there in terms of their mental health, and how that affects their athletic and academic performance. That's kind of the nutshell version of the day-to-day. One thing I love about that job or this job or these jobs is that it's different every day.
So when you're working with the athletes, it sounds like it's mostly performance-based, which is what I would probably expect in an athletic department. But do you also find yourself with certain athletes digging into, like you mentioned, some existential questions, but for some of the athletes that I work with, oftentimes when we start to dig into like deficiencies in performance or deficiencies in dealing with the inner dialogue that's often getting in the way of their performance, oftentimes we end up going in a direction of like psychodynamic processing where we will end up doing more therapy than we will performance stuff. But it all is leading back to a greater understanding of like, hey, this is how this fear of performance or fear of acceptance or fear of success or fear of failure was developed in the first place, maybe in your youth with parents, having high expectations or whatever it was that we explored. And by getting a greater understanding, they're better able to now have a conversation in their mind and say, these feelings are not necessarily valid anymore. I can let these go. I can overcome these. These are from the past. Do you find yourself digging into actual therapy with the athletes, or are you primarily focused on performance-based things?
No, I'd say probably 80% of what I do, 80 to 90% is more traditional therapy. I think I do approach it with a performance mindset in that, I think you can think about their lives anyway as partially academic performance, partially athletic performance, and partially sort of social performance, if you will, or just being a person, being a developing young adult. So I think, and I don't know that I ever really articulated that until you were talking about it in terms of thinking about it from a performance standpoint. But yeah, most of what I see is anxiety or depression or roommate issues or teammate issues or, family of origin stuff, trauma, those kind of things, which I think can still be approached, like you were saying, from that sort of present, focused. I'm happy to sit and conceptualize, when somebody's like, where did this come from? Why am I like this? Just to say, well, look, if we look back at your parents and you sort of see the genetic, go through the whole biopsychosocial, spiritual kind of realm with them. It's to say, genetically, you're predisposed for this because your parents are this way or that way. And then being raised in a household like that, and then you have this and you have that. And then, when we get to the end of the conceptualization, I tend to ask them, so what do you want to do with all that? Because ultimately, when you walk out of this office, you still have to go be you. You still have to either go sit in that classroom or go to that practice session or go out, just go out and walk around town and interact with people. So, and not that solves the world's problems or anything like that, but I think sort of the similar way in terms of diagnostics in our field is that I think they're important for certain aspects of our work, but really not. I mean, you're going to treat someone in terms of their psychological care differently if they have a depressive disorder versus an addictive disorder versus an anxiety-based disorder. But, ultimately, I don't know that it matters what the diagnostics are. It's more like what is going to help you function in your day-to-day life. And so that's where that performance mindset thing comes back up, is that, we're dealing with depression here. We're also dealing with, and we're not dealing with depression. We're dealing with an individual with depression, right? And so the individual is a very different person-to-person kind of experience. I think thinking about it, having that performance mindset can help them, one, tolerate the discomfort of the depressive episode, but then also understand that there are ultimately lots of parts of us that we have control over, even when we feel out of control. I think that is the interesting twist, where the clinical really takes on more of a performance approach, because we're dealing with athletes, we're dealing with performers.
Yeah, I think the majority of my clients are not athletes or performers. Most are addictions clients or general psychotherapy or people looking for spiritual development. But I love that you're talking about this performance lens, because I feel like that's the lens that I primarily operate out of as well. I was classically trained at CU with psychodynamic theory and did my own self-study with Jungian therapy and things like that. But I approach all my clients, doesn't matter what their issue is, through a performance lens, because in my mind, every single moment of our life is a performance of some sort. Whether it's being a parent, well, yeah, that's a performance. Are you being the best parent that you can be? Or your job, that's a performance too. Are you being the best at your job you can be? And so dealing with the disorders and the diagnostics is great, because then it still goes back to performance. We're dealing with someone with depression, but for me, I approach it like, well, the depression is getting in the way of you being your best self, of being your most optimal self, of performing at your best. And it's getting in the way of you performing in your relationships, at school, at work, in social life. And so let's work on improving the performance by, using whatever performance-based tools we can do to help you either cope with or overcome, whatever mental diagnosis you may fall under. I try not to assign diagnostics to anybody if I can avoid it, because those things often follow people throughout their entire life, and they become stigmatized, or they start to self-identify with the diagnosis, feeling like, oh, well, my therapist said I'm depressed, therefore I'm going to call myself depressed for the rest of my life, and that's now become part of my identity. And I think that's something really damaging that we can do if we're not being mindful as clinicians, is causing these stories within our clients to shift in ways that are not going to be helpful for them in the long run.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think too, what I tell, parents and coaches and administrators is like, look, I might spend 168th of somebody's week with them. I mean, think about that in terms of percentage. That's incredibly small. So if I think I have the whole picture because I spend an hour a week with them, or even 2 or 3, let's say, right? And then I offer a diagnosis based on that. I guess what we're seeing, what I've seen over the last, let's say 20 years is 25, maybe even going back to when I was in undergrad, is this sort of over-diagnosis of certain things. And then, like exactly what you said, then people start to identify as that thing. They think they need medication for that thing. And maybe the diagnosis isn't actually accurate, And so I think we're seeing that we saw that with ADHD back in the 90s. We're seeing that with bipolar disorder now, or I am anyway, where everybody and their grandmother has bipolar disorder. And statistically, it's just not the way it works. I think there's a lot of other things going on for a number of those people that, and sometimes maybe for that diagnostician, it's easier to tell somebody that I think you have bipolar disorder than it is to say, I think you have a borderline personality disorder. And to even explain what that means. So I've been fortunate to work in settings where I don't have to offer diagnosis to get reimbursed. I think that's the other part, is that our insurance world is driven by diagnostics. And, I had a performance client a couple of years ago, and again, it's same as you're saying, where you have this sort of crossover into personal stuff with performance stuff. And so, the mom was like, look, I appreciate, I'm paying you all this money, and, but I'd really like to get reimbursed from insurance. What's your diagnosis? And I was like, oh, you got to give me a minute. Like I can come up with one. And, it was sort of when you sit down and look at what I had been given at that point, it's sort of adjustment disorder with some depressed mood, a little bit of mixed mood, so it wasn't hard to offer a diagnosis, but to your point, it's hard to offer it when it's going to be on somebody's medical record somewhere. It's like, kid's having a hard time. Like, yeah, that's an adjustment disorder with depressed mood, but he's going to be all right, So.
Yeah, I'm. The more I grow in my own practice and in my own understanding of psychology and the mind, I'm definitely going more in favor of Jungian type psychology as opposed to Freudian, and sort of holistic as opposed to being locked into one psychological theory. So I like to consider myself more eclectic, and that's kind of why I chose to pursue a PhD in social work now instead of psychology, is because social work, the way I've read it described, and this is so beautiful to me, it's almost as if social work is this lush soil. It's like a breeding ground for multidisciplinary approaches to solving social issues. So for me, the way I think about it is like, if social work is the CU stadium, the big football stadium where the sports are played, maybe psychology is the quarterback and sociology is the running back, and physics and quantum mechanics is, you know, one of the defensemen, right? But social work is the environment, or is the ground in which all these things can come together to form a greater understanding, where the sum can be greater than the individual parts.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that approach, because it's not, you know, the understanding of consciousness is not just limited to psychology, but it's also, you know, we got to understand quantum mechanics and how quantum particles work, and how thoughts cause vibration and frequency and have physical effects on matter around us. And we have to understand, like, that our thoughts are not just, you know, concepts in the mind, but they have a physical presence. So I'm really fascinated by that. What are some of your current projects and interests in the field that you're currently pursuing right now?
Yeah, it's much less existential, but but honestly, a lot of it is the destigmatization of mental health and mental health care. You know, we still have this sort of over-masculinized environment of intercollegiate athletics and of athletics in general, where, you know, there are still people with the rub some dirt on it philosophy to injury rehab, you know, and there's still a lot of stigma around not just mental health as a broad idea, but around identities, you know, and so intersectionality of identities, and that's another, I think, sort of buzzword at this point in the last maybe 5 years of exactly what you mentioned, the gestalt of it. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? And so I think as individuals, we are greater than the labels and the identities to which we adhere, or to which we identify. The words. You know, I consider myself more than who people see me to be, right? And so I think trying to get student athletes, coaches, administrators, academicians to understand that a student athlete is more than a football player who goes to school and is studying sociology. You know, they're a son, they're a brother, they're a cousin, they're an aunt or an uncle, and sometimes a father, sometimes a breadwinner. You know, so even understanding that, getting people to understand and therefore destigmatize mental health through that, I think is part of where I see things going in the next few years. At CU, we've started a group called the Boulder Buffs, which is peer-led destigmatization and education around mental health. So, you know, we know statistically that when people are struggling, they go to their friends first. So empowering those friends to sort of be able to connect somebody to resources, to be able to recognize when a friend is struggling, and then to be able to refer them to somebody who can help. And the student athletes, honestly, generationally, they seem to get it. You know, I think there's still a lot of stigma within our coaches, and not just at CU, like within the ranks of the coaches. There are a lot nowadays who really get it, especially compared to even 10 or 15 years ago. And then to administration. You know, you and I have talked about this a bunch over the years, but behavioral health, mental health does not pay. It's not a money-making venture. So when it makes it to that level of administration, you know, explaining to administrators, look, you want mental health practitioners because in theory, they can prevent things from happening, bad things that will have a negative impact on the lives of the other student athletes. And you know, administrators now are very responsive to social comparison. So, you know, if another school in the Pac-12, for instance, you know, they might have 3 practitioners, and then I say, hey, look, so-and-so's got 3 people now. We could really use that 3rd person. You know, sort of using our powers for a little bit of evil right there, where we're sort of, you know, we're both educating the administrators, but then also saying, hey, look, if we want to keep up with the Joneses, we got to keep up with the Joneses. So yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff I feel like right now, and it's been maybe a year of this kind of work, and I'm hoping for that work to continue, where it is education, but it's education from like that side view. It's not just the one-on-one stuff. It's more that that social work mentality, as you described it, right? Of educating student athletes and coaches and administrators and parents and other practitioners, and doing that kind of stuff. This is how we can destigmatize mental health in athletics. That's kind of where a lot of my passion is right now.
Nice. I like that, and I feel like that's something that's really important that needs to be done in our field, especially. I too believe in destigmatizing mental health for sure, and I feel like most of the field still currently focuses too much on disordered behaviors and things that are wrong with people and trying to fix things. Rather than I'm akin more to like Abraham Maslow's theories around positive psychology and around focusing more on people's strengths and developing strengths as opposed to focusing mostly on what's wrong with people. And I think that's currently what the general population thinks, that if you need therapy, something's wrong with you. Well, that's the furthest thing from the truth. I think that everybody could benefit from therapy. Just having someone else to talk to in a confidential way to bounce ideas off of is always a good thing, and instead of it being about mental disorders, maybe focusing more on mental wellness and mental health, and like, hey, how can we teach these people, like you said, to prevent more mental health issues? That's actually one of the ideas that I have for possible dissertation in the future is coming up with and designing curriculum for elementary, middle school, and high school aged youth, like a curriculum around consciousness, around mindfulness, and just not coming at them saying like, this is what consciousness is, but more like, hey, let's open up the conversation. Let's show you that this is important to think about. And let's give you some framework, some language, some tools so that you can engage your friends around these ideas of consciousness and resilience and mental toughness, and gain the mindfulness skills to actually prevent more mental health issues later in life. Because I feel like if we can teach preventative mental health, then we can significantly reduce the overall cost to society that taxpayers pay for mental health, as well as reduce the overall anguish that people feel, reduce PTSD, reduce the instances of trauma if people have the skill sets already to deal with it as it happens more effectively. And also along the lines of destigmatizing, I'm also working on destigmatizing mental health, but sort of from a different angle. So I'm sure you heard of the decriminalized Denver effort where mushrooms were decriminalized. So I've been really pushing and advocating for destigmatization of the use of psychedelics to treat mental health issues. There's a lot of good research coming out showing its effectiveness for addiction as well as a number of mental health issues. And there's still a huge stigma around the therapeutic benefits of some of these medicines as well. So we're kind of working on this issue from different angles, but I think it's really important that as practitioners, we are addressing this because I don't think everyone in our field is addressing it. What are your thoughts on the preventative?
No. Yeah, I think that honestly, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that I still think that societally and especially within the realm of intercollegiate athletics, we are very reactive. And that's not just for mental health. I mean, that's and then we've seen a shift in terms of physical health to the prevention, right? With athletic trainers working on prehab versus rehab, right? And even the idea of strength training, which, isn't that old in terms of age in athletics. It used to be people who lifted weights for bodybuilders, and that was it. And that wasn't so long ago. I mean, it was before I was born, but it's been a little minute. But even that idea of being, hey, the reason we're lifting these weights or doing this in this way is for prevention of injury. It's not just about strength anymore. It's about prevention of injury. It's about, and then you even see people now where, they tear an ACL and they take a couple days to let the swelling go down. And then they start working out those muscles around the knees so that when they have the surgery, they're more prepared to come out and get right back to it. And so I think medically what we're looking at is that some more efforts towards prevention. And I think mental health wise, we need to do the same. I think a lot of what we're trying to do is through education. And like you said, getting out in front of it, because the cost on the back end is so much more. You know, when you have somebody that is really struggling with their mental health and who is mentally ill, we'll say, you know, has sort of crossed that. I sort of think about them on almost like a continuum, you know, where we strive for mental health or psychological health, and at times we struggle with mental illness or psychological illness. And then, you know, just when you think about, man, the lack of resources that we have available for individuals who are struggling, to me, a good way to counterbalance that is to get out in front of it and do that preventive work. And like you said, whether it's educating people around their, I think you're right to use terms like resilience and mental toughness and stuff like that, but to mix in that awareness of consciousness and even some of the body scan stuff that people do now in therapy, you know, like understanding where you hold your stress. And so if you have a pain in your neck, it's not, I'm going to take some Advil for it. It's, I'm going to do my progressive muscle relaxation or my deep breathing or my meditation or even being aware that your neck is tight, you know, like those kind of things. I think preventative medicine wise is really, I think that's the place we are headed. I hope we are.
Yeah, I definitely feel like preventative mental health is the wave of the future. But my biggest, I guess, question or obstacle that I've been turning around in my mind is, how do we take such deep and existential topics as like consciousness and the mind and things like we're talking about today as adults? How do we take that information and present it in a way with language that's appropriate for elementary school kids, for middle school kids? Like, how do we rewrite and educate kids based on their brain developmental level? You know, we can't just come out and say, you know, to a kid that, you know, mindfulness and controlling your mind is super important, and, you know, consciousness and ego and all these things are, but like to a kid, like that doesn't mean anything, you know? So how do we,
most adults, it doesn't mean anything.
yeah. So how do we talk to the people that we need to the most, the kids before they develop mental health issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I think that's a great question, and it's one for those who have chosen child psychology to tackle more so than me. But yeah, I think that's one thing we've seen in colleges for a number of years, is that we're inheriting individuals who already have some issues or already have some challenges or already have a mindset that might not be as conducive to awakening awareness, if you will, you know. And so I think you're right. We got to speak to the kids. But so working with USA Boxing, there's a person that does coach education, and part of what he and I are working on is teaching mental skills for performance to younger athletes. And excuse me, part of that is the language we're using, is what words are we choosing. So I think we can use some of the words in the popular media, or the words the kids might hear from their parents or their teachers, to encapsulate what we want them to know about consciousness, about awareness, about mindfulness, without using those words, right? It's, you know, hey, you remember how when your teacher or your parents really want you to pay attention? Yeah, well, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about paying attention to what's going on inside versus outside. You know, just not necessarily, I don't think dumbing it down is the answer, because I think then you're talking down to that person, and I think kids pick up on that better than a lot of people. But using language that makes sense to them already, and helping them come up with their own language for it.
Yeah, so I like how you said use the language that they're already using, and what popped in my head right away, and I've given thought to this too, is maybe the language of our youth today is technology, that technology is their language. And so thinking about, maybe we can teach kids how to explore their mind through mindfulness and meditation and things, maybe through adaptive virtual reality experiences or through computer programs or neurofeedback and biofeedback, games that they can play. They're already playing games on their computer. Let's just teach them how to play the games with their mental power as opposed to, a joystick or something. So we're already using biofeedback and things like that to train athletes. I think that we can teach kids how to engage, those brainwave states that optimize mental functioning, and teach them from a very young age with very practical tools that we already have today.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, maybe
them too how to take that computerized version of it and bring it into the real life functioning piece. Where I don't know. There's part of me that really thinks the technology. I think it's like a pendulum, where we're sort of so immersed in technology right now. I think at some point, one of the generations is going to be like, nah, I'm not doing cell phones. And everybody's going to be like, what's that like? I just saw something this morning on one of the news stations about van life, how certain individuals are choosing to live in a van or an RV and travel because they're able to, through technology, to continue working. One story was on this financial planner who was living in a bus with his family. They have 4 kids and a wife and him, and he's a financial planner. But as long as he's got Wi-Fi, he can do his job. So, I think the more kids have that experience or understand that, hey, look, I can use technology for what I need it for, which is to advance my mind, and then I can go practice those skills with individuals or, whatever it is, however it plays out. I think maybe that's, in 20 years or something when I'm old and decrepit. But I think that maybe is the evolution of what you're talking about too, is we have these kids who take what we can give them now in terms of the technology piece and the understanding of the mind, and then they run with that and they start to understand it really is more about these relationships and these personal connections, the intrapersonal as well as the interpersonal.
Yeah, my hope is that through educating and teaching others, not just kids, but other adults, concepts of the mind and consciousness, is that, I'm not ever going to have all the answers, but hopefully maybe I'll plant a seed in somebody who will find a deeper answer. And then hopefully they'll share that. The podcast for me is my effort to try and bring some of this knowledge and make it shared knowledge, so your experience and my experience are just as valid as anyone else's experience, but we can learn from I can learn from your mistakes and your insights, and you can learn from mine. And I think the more conversations and connections we have like this, the greater understanding we have as a species and as a social unit. That collective consciousness, I think, is super important to engage in. And this is sort of my effort to do that. So the last little question I had for you, and this is something that, you and I have dealt with in our practice quite a bit. And this is the idea of clients and just people in general who feel a desire to want to escape reality in some way. And whether that be, people have numerous reasons for wanting to escape, fear, trauma, being triggered, depression, bad circumstances, whatever it is. And people will find all sorts of different ways to escape, whether it's through sex or addiction to drugs or going and running, finding escape through exercise. What do you think it is about human beings in general, or maybe just about society as it is right now, that people want to escape the reality that we're in? I mean, what's so wrong with reality that people want to escape it so much?
Yeah, I think about it in terms of distress tolerance. I think because we are so connected to societally, and that somebody was telling me this a while back, and I just kind of latched onto it because I really like the idea. They said, think back how you and I maybe even were educated in college, right? It was you sit in front of the professor and they tell you things and then you accept those and then maybe you question them and maybe you don't and maybe you kind of think about it for a little bit. And then you fast forward to now where a professor can stand in front of a class and tell them something as fact, and within about 5 seconds, somebody in that class can Google that and figure out whether or not it's right or wrong, right? So like the instantaneous reward that we are given for anything, like even the fact that Google it is a verb. I laugh with my same age friends now about when we were kids. If you didn't know something, you had to find somebody who did, or you had to go find an encyclopedia, which was, you had to have some money to have an encyclopedia back in the day. Those books were expensive, but you had to do more with it. But then there was also there's like this instantaneous reward idea, right? Like love Uber because it's actually cutting down the number of DUIs I've seen in the last 5 years. So appreciate that. But then, you literally don't have to leave your house anymore. You can order food to your house. You can have everything you want. And so, but it's an instantaneous reward thing. So I think the escapism for a lot of us, even back in my day, escapism I don't think it's a new thing. I think we all, that's why you play pretend when you're a kid. That's why you're a prince and there's a princess and there's a castle, or that's why, there's 2 out in the bottom of the 9th and in reality you're standing on the street playing street ball, but you conjure that up. And so I think, I don't know, some of it I think is that distress tolerance piece and the fact that we forget that we're going to be okay. Let's say I'm not comfortable doing a certain task, but you know what? I can figure out a way to overcome that discomfort and to continue to function and to have some success at it, whatever it is. So I don't know that escapism in terms of what we're talking about is anything new. I mean, you know the history of addiction probably better than I do, and it's been around for forever, and I think. So I think some of it is that what you were talking about earlier, that resilience training, that mental toughness training, is to remind people. It's not even a training thing. It's similar to, I think, what we're talking about with mindfulness, is that it's been part of us evolutionarily for so long. All we have to do is just remember that we have that. So I think all we have to do is remember that we are resilient beings. And yeah, sometimes feelings hurt, but then also I think it's a good place to remind people there, like you mentioned earlier as well, is that there are places you can go and you can sit with somebody and they can share your experience for a minute. And,
so do you feel like overall people's ability to handle distress has decreased because of the conveniences that society sort of affords us these days? Because you mentioned distress tolerance, and I agree, and I believe that that's also something that we can train into ourselves through exposure therapies. And the more challenging situations we put ourselves in intentionally and come out the other end having succeeded or failed and learn from our mistakes, the better we get at handling that stressor the next time it comes our way. But do you think that with all the conveniences and everything, people are just worse at handling stress, that maybe this is one of those superpowers that we're starting to forget how to do?
I suppose I think it's like everything else in our world, is that some people are still pretty good at it and others are not. Let's take your performance situation, right? Like jiu-jitsu, like I'm sure there's positions in jiu-jitsu that are not comfortable. And in order to prevail, you have to get sort of comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And that's like one of those borrowed phrases again. But, I think certain parts of athletics are very protective in that way, in that they teach us distress tolerance. If you made it to the level that you're at professionally or even that collegiate athlete, like you've learned distress tolerance in some way, shape, or form. You may not recognize it as that, but then that, I think, is sort of in our world, our job to do that, is to point those things out to those individuals. So I don't know if we're not as good at it, or if we just don't remember that we can be good at it.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, almost like the forgotten mindfulness piece.
Mm-hmm.
We forget that we have that ability to do it until someone points it out to us or retrains us in the skill. Yeah, and I've also heard theories too. My friend down in Boulder wrote a paper recently that he published about how escapism, especially through addiction, is actually, there's nothing wrong with that. And in our culture, we see that as like a disordered behavior, when actually, if you look at the entire history of human beings, we tend to have a natural inclination to go towards pleasure and try and avoid pain. And one of the ways to avoid pain, especially emotional pain, is to numb it out or to escape. And so he argues that addiction, or the development of addiction, or the desire to want to go to substances to escape, is actually a natural coping mechanism that has been with us for a long time. Unfortunately, it causes a lot of damage, but that we shouldn't even be stigmatizing addicts and alcoholics for their behavior, because it's a natural coping skill. It's an easy access. It's something that works, and it works really well, but it also does a lot of damage. And so teaching people instead that, like, it's kind of like finding this balance. Like, if it's natural for us to want to escape pain, but also seek pleasure, and then on the other hand, we're trying to promote, mindfulness and be more present rather than escaping, especially when things go wrong. Like, be really present in those moments too, because you can really learn from it. We're sort of throwing out two messages that are in contradiction a little bit. And it's difficult for even someone with our training like myself to make sense of, like, do I want to be super mindful, or be mindful and present with reality as it is in all of its challenges, or is it okay to escape, knowing that that's a natural part of my evolution to want to escape pain, and that's kind of a dichotomy, an interesting.
Yeah. I'd be curious to hear what your colleague thinks about. Like, I think you're right, and I think we're on the same track. I think, so again, Letitia, and there's a colleague, you might know him actually, his name's Ben Court. They go around and speak on weed, sort of nationally, and a lot in the athletic world. And, Ben wrote a book called Weed Incorporated, where he talks about the commercialization of weed in Colorado. But the first line of the book says, if you're a recreational marijuana user over the age of 25, I'm not talking to you. And it's not like I'm not trying to talk to you. It's like, I'm more worried about that younger user. Like, when are we getting started using this stuff? And I think that, to your point again about dissertation topics, is when you start talking to younger kids about this idea of escapism and use. I think you're right. We're fairly hedonistic in our culture and as people. I think when you start talking to them younger about, hey, here's how you manage psychic pain, basically, like psychological pain. Here's a healthier way to do it, rather than smoking cigarettes, taking a drink, smoking weed, doing some coke, doing some heroin, whatever, right? I don't know that I can see use being, like, in terms of your buddy's article, like, I can see, like, being, but I think and again, you and I have shared a lot of these experiences where, you see use turn into addiction, and then that becomes incredibly destructive, and it then causes pain. And even for the user, right? It's not using is not a pleasurable experience anymore. It's to reduce pain, and there's no pleasure there. And so that's the part that I think I've seen over the years. And again, my involvement in an addiction is very peripheral to Letitia and individuals like yourself who work with people in addiction and, struggling with addiction and recovery and those kind of things. But I mean, just seeing the ripple effect, I have a hard time seeing where I think I don't know. just kind of waxing philosophic, I guess. But, I think definitely use is something. And I think part of it is that to think about being ever mindful is kind of exhausting, And so I think some people still will use, and you can say that about something like caffeine. Like caffeine's a drug, right? It's mind-altering, right? I mean, I don't know. I think about that like a drug. And it's one that is fully legalized and you can have as a kid. And I mean, I think we're probably, myself included, we're growing addiction in people around caffeine. I mean, I had a latte once or twice a day. You know what I'm saying? So is it the drug that we're talking about? Because people are like, oh, marijuana's not that bad. It's the same as alcohol, this, that, and the other. Why is alcohol legal? And like the federal government figured out how to make money off of it. Same with caffeine, same with nicotine. And so I think, I wonder if it's the process versus the product of the process, if you will. Yeah, it's curious, man.
Yeah, and I don't only see this behavior with drugs and alcohol, but escapism through exercise and activity and sport and things like that too. And I feel like in general, we as human beings are always looking to change our reality to make it better in some way. Hopefully. I mean, I think that's always our goal. So we're always trying to set things up so that we feel more pleasure and less pain. And I think a part of that is, when we're feeling uncomfortable and when we're feeling sad or depressed or anxious, those don't feel good. And so we try and alter our reality in some way, whether it's with a drug or, even exercise. I mean, we're altering the drugs in our brain. So, we are changing the chemistry and escaping from the feeling that we were not comfortable with. And so that goes back to mindfulness for me. Like, if we truly want to learn the most about ourselves and actually overcome some of these maladaptive mental states, we need to sit with them more. We need to sit with the anxiety. We need to be more mindful of the depression. We need to go towards these things with curiosity rather than trying to avoid them or trying to escape them or cover them up with other pharmaceutical drugs or sweep them under the rug or stigmatize them. I think that going towards these things that scare us will give us more understanding and therefore take some of the power out of those afflictions. That's my view on it anyway. But but if you could impart any last bit of knowledge on the listeners out there, something that maybe you have learned from your own life experience that you feel is a bit of wisdom that you can impart on the listeners, what would that be?
That's a really good question. I think like you were talking about the leadership styles, I find that I get the most out of my leadership experiences when I lead from within. When I have that sort of servant leadership mentality but I guess maybe that's the piece is just listen. When you listen to other people, you can learn a ton. I learn so much every time you and I talk about whatever it is that we're talking about. Right. And I think if we can start to have that experience with each other, where it's not about, let me tell you what I know versus let me hear what you got to say, and we truly listen. And that goes back to that mindfulness piece, right? Is to truly be engaged with that person, listen to what they have to say, and then incorporate that into our experience. Like that's the place I'm at now, professionally and personally, where that's the good stuff. Nice.
Well, thanks, Chris. I wanted to thank you again for coming on the podcast. It was super fun talking with you as always. And if the listeners want to get in touch with you, or if they have questions or anything like that, how can they best get in touch with you?
Great question. So as of right now and through probably mid-July, you can just shoot me an email. Actually, you know what? I'll just do my regular email is just chrisbader@gmail.com. One of those lucky few that got into the Gmail craze before it was a craze. I actually have just my first and last name.
Is there a period between your first and last name?
Nope.
Okay. Chris Bader at Gmail.
Yep. Just hit me up through that. I mean, as you can probably attest, I'm not always the most swift at returning emails, but that's probably the most reliable communication method at this point.
Right on. Well, again, thanks for coming on the show today, Chris. I really appreciate it. And here's to more explorations of the mind in the future. So for all you listeners out there, hope you picked up some valuable information today. I know I did. And until next time, stay true to yourself and try and be more mindful of that inner voice and that inner dialogue, trying to understand and become awoken to who you really are. Until next time, this is Shane Lemaster with Conversations with the Mind. Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.